If you haven't noticed, history is being rewritten right in front of your face. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not some kind of a schizo idea. It is a scientific truth. Right in front of us, every single day, history is being changed to benefit a very small group of people at the expense of the entire human experience. And of course you've noticed this. You have no choice, right? If you are truly being objective, you have absolutely seen that mainstream history is based off of all kinds of these horrible fabrications, complete and utter corrupt lies that have been used to generate what we now call the mainstream timeline. Now, the mainstream timeline doesn't benefit you or me. Maybe you've noticed this. The mainstream timeline benefits a very small amount of people on this planet. All right, that is all that's happening here. It's very, very simple. So for me, it gets weird when I find people who are relatively aware that the modern chronology is corrupt. The modern chronology has problems, right? The modern chronology is absolutely not correct. Let's just put it like that. Right? A lot of people see that, but it's weird because they'll acknowledge that, but then when they go and they do their historical studies, they will still adhere to a lot of the mainstream garbage. For example, right now, if you are getting into chronology, one of the things that is painfully obvious is that there is no such thing as a dark age, right? There are no such thing as any of these dark ages, right? There's more than one dark age. Medieval chronologers had to create multiple dark ages to fill up this timeline that they had generated, right? So we have multiple gaps within our historical record that are essentially fabrications. And this is a scientific fact. So that's why more and more people are starting to come around to understanding that this is a problem, that chronology legitimately has problems. However, we do find a situation to where cognitive dissonance is still alive and well within the community. And what I want to do today is I want to talk about one of these subjects that is absolutely unbelievably frustrating. When I see good researchers, doing their thing, and then all of a sudden they will start to cite something like Manetho or Manetho or Maneth. I don't know how you pronounce his name. It doesn't matter. The dude's not real. Manetho? Anyway, I'm gonna call him Little Bit. Manetho is essentially a guy who wrote a chronology of Egypt. Now, Manetho is supposed to have existed around somewhere in 285 to 486 BC. Right, this is what the mainstream claims. And this guy goes on ahead and he writes this whole history of Egypt. Right, and this history was designed for the Hellenistic world. So, so of course, because the book is supposed to be ancient, it must be completely true. Now, I'll be honest, there are so many things that irritate the crap out of me when it comes to talking about Manetho. Is that, I might be a little unfocused. I know, right? Something completely new for the show, but there are so many angles to express hatred, right? I mean, just pure, unadulterated, just absolute disgust, hatred. I mean, you can name any kind of annoyance, kind of emotion. It's just, okay. All right, so let's start at the beginning of why I'm talking about this at all. So, one of the things that is going on right now in the alternative communities, the alternative historic communities, is that slowly chronology is starting to play more and more of a role. And the reason why is simple. The science demands it. Now, of course, this is taking time because the vast majority of the planet has been conditioned with a very specific historical timeline, and anything that goes against that timeline is not possible, right? You're a crazy conspiracy theorist if you believe anything else other than what is on Wikipedia. I mean, that is quite literally the society we live in right now. I mean, Wikipedia has been proven to be corrupt. There's like, what, 2 dudes who ultimately like sit there and edit everything on that website. And if you go against what they say, like your stuff gets deleted. I mean, it's insane. Anyway, obvious propaganda. It's obvious propaganda, by the way, right? Wikipedia is not here to help you, right? They're here to push a very specific message, and that message will be pushed. You are not allowed to challenge it. So that's where we find ourselves. Anyway, so, but you know, the mainstream narrative has problems. And more and more people are starting to realize that. However, you know, there are leaps that a lot of people are unwilling to make right now. And I don't want to get into all of them, and I couldn't anyway, but the one we're going to focus on today is getting away from this stupid Manetho garbage. Right now, both in the alternative and the mainstream, this Manetho guy's work is essentially taken as the holy truth of chronology, and it basically lays everything out. And what we have nowadays is we have Egyptian chronology, and by extension Greek and Roman chronology, like calibrated on works like what Manetho has done. Like Manetho's work is one of the big ones. Whenever you see, I mean, especially if, actually, you know what really irritated me? It was actually listening to a Bible historical scholar guy trying to figure out the biblical chronology, right? Those guys, I feel sorry for those guys because they don't realize that the Bible was literally written in the Middle Ages, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, and its design was not for them to, anyway, I don't want to get into that. But what biblical scholars will do is they will use Egyptian chronology to try and date and figure out, you know, what took place when during the Bible. For example, a lot of people, they try to figure out when Moses lived, right? Because they want to know when the Exodus took place. Right now, we know the Exodus did take place, and we actually have a pretty good date for it now, although it's not exactly like the Bible says. It's like it is, but it isn't. But the chronology that people are trying to use to date something like the Exodus and trying to figure out who the hell Moses was, they look towards works like Manetho. And it's unfortunate because there's no reason to believe any of these works that are supposedly ancient, right? There's no reason for it. But the problem is when one of these Bible scholars, for example, tries to do this stuff, they grab the Bible and they're like, I'm going to figure out all of these dates. Right, and they use Manetho as a source. The vast majority of these scholars are operating under the assumption that Manetho's works are generally correct. Right? And this is what I want to talk about, because this is the stuff that annoys the crap out of me. And if you're wondering why I'm listening to Bible scholars, it's not that I believe in the Bible or God or anything like that. It's just, sometimes you can find good science that comes out of some of these biblical chronologists because they're looking for the truth, right? They're trying to prove their Bible. And so they're looking for anything they can kind of find to make those discoveries. Sometimes they find legitimately amazing scientific information. 99% of the time, biblical scholars will completely misread what they find, right? Sometimes you just want to reach into the screen and just start choking them because of how close they are to figuring out what they're looking at, but they don't realize what they're looking at because they're keeping it in the context of the Bible, right? God and Jesus and all that stuff, and not understanding what they actually found. But anyways, okay, I know, I digress. But Manetho will generally be used as a chronological backbone for trying to figure out what's going on in the Bible. Now, the reason why they do this is because the mainstream uses it as well. So mainstream Egyptology, the way they have their chronology all built up, it's done in the same manner, right? They take Manetho as a fact, essentially, more or less. Completely, really, almost. It's funny. You can find these people contradicting themselves sometimes when they source Manetho and they talk about Manetho, Egyptologists, or anybody that uses him, I guess. They'll say, oh yeah, well, Manetho claims this, this, and this. We know it's that date, and that date. So you've got this ruler, and this ruler, which means that we know for a fact that this event took place here. And then in the next paragraph in the paper, it'll say something like, but we're pretty sure that this king did not reign during this specific time because it does not line up with my original theory. Like, this happens all the time, right? It's hilarious. The cognitive dissonance used with sourcing Manetho is hilarious. Because both the alternative and the mainstream and the biblical, they will pick and choose what they like to prove whatever the hell it is they're trying to prove. And then if something in the Manetho script itself goes against what they are working with, they'll either ignore it, or they'll simply say, well, this couldn't quite be actually right. Manetho must have messed up here. But he totally is correct with what my theory proclaims. Right? It's the dumbest thing. It's absolutely insane, and they have no problem doing this. There is no issue with it. Right? They will look you in the eye with a straight face and say garbage like this, and they expect you to believe it. Okay. So what's wrong with using Manetho? Right? I mean, what is wrong with it? All right, well, hold on. Okay, what the hell is Manetho? Let's go over what Manetho is first, because not everybody knows what the hell this is. So whenever you look at Egyptology, whether it's alternative or mainstream, remember, both sides use Manetho. Both sides use it. Like, they use it to get you years, to get you names of rulers that, they just know for a fact had to have existed and all of this crap. But most people have no idea who the hell Manetho is. So let me educate you on this piece of garbage work. All right, so I think I already said it, but Manetho was a historian. He was essentially an Egyptian priest during the reign of Ptolemy II. Right? And so he lived around 285 to 246. And I say around because the reality is we have no clue when this dude lived. Right? There was no chronology or chronological dating system in the sense that we use it now back then. It just didn't exist. So this 285 to 246 BC situation, completely guessing. Like, they have no idea. Right? But anyways, but they believe it, so it has to be true. Okay, anyway. So he will eventually write a book about the history of Egypt called Egyptica, which basically means history of Egypt. And this was meant for the Hellenistic world. All right? And that in and of itself is kind of interesting if you think about it. That we'll get to it. Anyway, so what Manetho does in his history of Egypt is that he will essentially write a full chronology of all of the Egyptian rulers, all in one book. And he will break these Egyptian rulers into 30 different dynasties. And there's an argument for 31 dynasties if you want to include the Ptolemies. All right, I'm not, that's splitting hairs, all right? The whole thing is stupid anyway. Okay, anyway. All right, so basically, the dynasties will become the basis for how modern geology, still to this day, categorizes all of the pharaohs. All right, they use his dates and his details to categorize the pharaohs. All right, so basically, it's just a book it's basically a chronological book. You can go find it. It's right now. I think it's on an Internet Archive as well. And it just kind of goes through all of the rulers. And he's got all of them. It's amazing. They're all there. It's all very convenient. I mean, it's basically a dream come true. You can crack open this book, and you can just go down the list, and you can see every single name of every single ruler, throughout all of these dynasties, and you can get a complete picture of what went down in ancient Egypt. Very nice, right? And if it was real, it would be amazing. An incredibly valuable book, if it was real. So what's the problem? Why am I complaining about this? This sounds fantastic. You mean some Greek back in the day, or some Hellenistic dude back in the day wrote this book? I mean, it has to be real, right? I mean, the Greeks were so smart. I mean, they're highly intelligent. Everything they wrote is 100% accurate and true. And for some weird magical reason, all of them reach to us today untouched, unfiltered, in perfect copies from what they were back in the day. Really? Really? That is what people believe. Right? People believe that there is this magical ancient Greek time period where you had all of these philosophers and scientists writing all of these books, right? All of this intellectual stuff. And then for some weird reason, Greece disappears from history. It collapses. And there's all kinds of stupid excuses that the mainstream will give. But for some weird reason, even though Greece will collapse into what essentially will be kind of a dark age, or it will be a Greek dark age, all of these works will be perfectly preserved throughout the next couple of centuries, and they will magically be found in the basements of people's dwellings in Europe or Italy. Right? Just magically. Not before. No, not before. All of these works will not succumb to the second law of thermodynamics. All of these works will not be destroyed by the next dark ages that will ravage the area. Oh no, they're all perfect. Everything gets transferred for somehow, some way, in a magical way, to where everybody in the Middle Ages suddenly can discover them again and can pick up exactly where the Greeks left off. Very, very convenient. Also very unbelievably stupid. This is literally what the mainstream believes. It is unbelievably ridiculous. Like, 2 seconds of critical thinking will immediately eliminate the concept of ancient Greece. And I know that's kind of outside of the scope of this work. And if you're wondering, wait, does he mean that ancient Greece never existed? Correct. There's no such thing as ancient Greece. Right, this ancient Greek period that everybody thinks existed, no such thing. No such thing. Just like there's not 3 Roman empires. Unbelievably stupid. Like, there's no evidence for it. Right? The only evidence that substantiates the claim for an ancient Greek time period is the works that are magically found in the Middle Ages. That's it. That is where all of our stories come from. Now, I know you're probably also saying, yeah, but what about all of the ruins? Yeah, what about them? What about them? How do you know they are specifically 2,000 plus years old, ascribed to this magical ancient Greek civilization? How do you know that? You only think you know that because all of those books in medieval Europe that were discovered told you that. That's it. That is it. That's the only reason why you think you know that. There's no such thing as ancient Greece. There's no such thing as a guy named Manetho that lived 2,300 years ago. And just okay, all right. I'm getting ahead of I'm really off scope if I'm honest. I'm just complaining because the whole ancient Greece thing, these civilizations that never existed, but they're like hardcore implanted into our mainstream chronology. It really is a testament to psychological conditioning and how easily people are manipulated into believing whatever the hell you want. I mean, it really is. Anyway, okay, I know. All right, so Manetho. So we have a problem right off the bat relative to everything I just said. Now, I've done shows talking about why ancient Greece never existed, and there's more to come. Like, that's a pretty broad topic, right? You know, especially if you're going to say something like, yes, but we have the ruins. How do you know those are Greek ruins? Right? The only reason why we call those Greek ruins is because we've been told to call them Greek ruins. Is it possible that those ruins actually belong to a completely different civilization that we simply don't have the correct records of, or that those records were destroyed, or that we have the records of and we are being completely misled due to the way mainstream history is currently run? Right? All of these questions are extremely valid and scientific, by the way. Right? These are the questions that nobody asks. Because everybody believes that these supposed highly intellectual historians, and they are smart. As a side note, I'm not saying these historians are stupid, right? They have just been convinced to believe in lies. That's it. Remember, from a scientific perspective, the smarter you are, the higher IQ you are, the easier you are to control. That is very basic psychological conditioning, right? That is a science. There's no way around it. Okay, it is that simple. Anyway, so Manetho writes this text supposedly, and it's a very convenient text. If you are a historian, this is the stuff that you really want to get your hands on, right? Because if you have a backbone to a chronology, that means you can start calibrating. Right? One of the biggest problems in history is calibration. How do you calibrate the histories? Remember, our current dating system, the AD-BC situation, has not been around for thousands of years. Right? Jesus did not show up one day, and he wasn't like teaching peace and love and hippie stuff while also saying, oh yeah, check out this chronology. Let's start doing everything from when I was born, and I guess I'll time travel back in time and tell everybody to start using the AD BC chronology so that we all line up. Like, that didn't happen. Like, Jesus, so far as I know, was not time traveling. That wasn't going on. Okay, so nobody is using the modern Anno Domini chronology back in the day. Nobody was using it. In fact, this is relatively new, right? Anno Domini has only been around for centuries, not thousands of years. This is new. And there's a reason why it's new, right? Because catastrophes hit Earth, the whole dating system changed multiple times. So, you know, anyway, that's a whole other problem. Okay, so, but we do not have a good way of calibrating history. So, when we find a book like this, something that Manetho writes called The History of Egypt, and he has all these detailed names in a nice, pretty list that's organized in 30 dynasties. That is very, very enticing. And it's so enticing that everybody ate it up. And they did. We all know that if something is too good to be true, yeah, it probably is. It probably is. And that's exactly what we find with Manetho. The first issue that we run into with the book of the History of Egypt is the fact that we have no original copies. Most people do not know this. We do not have a single original copy from supposed ancient Greece that deals with any of these ancient Greek texts. Plato, Aristotle, doesn't matter, any of them. And Manetho is no exception. We have no scientific evidence whatsoever. Zero, zilch, nada. It does not exist. We have zero scientific evidence that a book by Manetho detailing the entire history of ancient Egypt up until his time period, you know, the 300s BC, ever existed. We have none of this. We have zero scientific reason to believe that the text in Manetho ever was written 2,300 years ago. There is nothing there. So why do we believe it? I mean, where the hell is this claim coming from? If we don't have the original dated manuscript from this time period, why the hell do we believe that it's from this time period? And it's simple. It's the same reason why people believe in a dark age. It's the same reason why people think there is a civilization called ancient Greece. It's because you have been told that these are truths. You have not been shown any scientific evidence whatsoever that is testable, that passes all the scientific methods required, that show you, that unequivocally prove that this manuscript was written back during that time period. Okay, we don't have it. Anytime anybody starts quoting or sourcing Manetho, you have to remember this. And this is a serious problem, because if we have no scientific evidence that proves that this book was legitimately written back during that time period, then what that does is that calls into question every single conclusion that author is making. Every single one. Because if they're basing their chronology off of anything that Manetho has written, right, suddenly there's no scientific validity. There's none. Right? There's no reason to trust Manetho. So that's problem number one, right off the bat. And that's a legitimate problem. There's no way around this. I don't care who you are. I don't care what kind of historian you are, archaeologist, biblical scholar, whatever. You believe in aliens. I don't care. What I just said is a scientific fact. We have no scientific reason whatsoever to believe that this book was written in the 300 BC era. None. So hopefully you're with me when I say that we have a serious problem. Okay, we have a serious problem with anybody quoting Manetho for whatever reason. Or at least in the context if they are trying to use that work to substantiate some kind of a historical claim. Alright, so we don't have the original. So if we don't have the original, then where the hell did the book come from? Ah, that's a really good question. Now you're asking good questions. Remember, that's one of the keys to life. Ask questions, but not just any question. Ask good questions. Ask great questions. All right, so let's ask just a basic question for fun. Where the hell did the Book of Manetho come from then? Right, when did it come from? What's going on? This is where it gets even funnier. So the first existing manuscript copies that will ever reach Europe were not direct copies of the Manetho manuscript. Instead, what Europe very first gets are manuscripts written by guys like Eusebius, Cincillus, and other later Byzantine chronographers. So when this book finally shows up in the quote-unquote mainstream, all of a sudden, we have this Egypt chronology. We don't even have the original Manetho manuscript. But not only do we not have the original, we don't even have copies of the original. All we get are bits and pieces of manuscripts written by somebody else entirely, like Eusebius. Okay, do we see a problem? I mean, do we see a problem? This is a problem. I could stop the show right here, literally, and that should be it. In fact, you could shut this off right now if you understand what I'm talking about, because this is it. I mean, I would shut this off just because the channel sucks. But at the very least, from a scientific perspective, you could, in theory, shut this off and be happy and, be scientifically accurate. Right? This is stupid. That's what it is. It's stupid. Right? Anyway, so these manuscripts are essentially copied in Greek and Latin. And these manuscripts will begin to circulate in European libraries around the 15th century. Now remember, this is the time period where all of these kinds of manuscripts are magically appearing. And what a surprise! Manetho's manuscript magically appears. But even worse, it doesn't appear directly. It appears written by other people. Okay, yeah. And of course, Joseph Scaliger will grab on to the fragments of what Cincillus and Eusebius are talking about, and he will use those fragments to reconstruct his own version of ancient chronologies. Okay, so this is Scaliger. This guy is corrupt to the bone. Right? We have two corrupt sources being combined together to create what will eventually become established chronology. This is not good science, right? We can all agree that this is bad stuff. The manuscript just doesn't exist at all. Like, the original text in the Greek that it was written in is completely gone. And then to make matters worse, when it starts to be recompiled, it's compiled from multiple different Byzantine scholars who are lost for thousands of years and then miraculously show up in the Middle Ages. Okay, this is what we are working with. It gets even worse, because what mainstream academics will try to do to defend all the stuff that I'm talking about here is they'll try to say, but wait a second, look, all of these chronologers are citing Manetho, so he must be real, right? You got Flavius Josephus. I know, I can't speak. You got him quoting Manetho. You have Julius Africanus quoting Manetho, blah, blah. You've got all of these other chronologers and historians seemingly quoting Manetho's work with respect to the Egyptian timeline. And on the surface, that does kind of sound great. It kind of makes it sound like, okay, fine, yes, I guess maybe it did exist, because why would all these people in various periods of ancient history be quoting a book if it didn't exist, right? That's a fair comeback. But that's only a fair comeback if you believe in the mainstream chronology, right? That's only a fair comeback if you don't pay attention to science and you don't pay attention to real history. Remember, what was going on in the Middle Ages was all of these authors were creating all of these forgeries. They were literally creating the history in the early and Middle Age era. So, when we find a situation to where Julius Africanus is writing something, or Eusebius is writing something, or Josephus is writing something, right? They are assuming The mainstream is assuming those guys are legitimately ancient. But once again, they fall into the exact same category that Manetho falls into. We have no proof that any of these people existed during the time periods that they existed. The only reason why we have any of these dates or any of these names whatsoever is because books found in the Middle Ages contain this story. So if you want to create a situation to where it looks like some book existed, all you have to do is essentially cite your own made-up forgeries. Right? If you forge Julius Africanus, if you forge Flavius Josephus, if you go through and you forge all of these supposed ancient authors, right, you're in control. You have the power. And if you start to connect these books throughout time, you can create a pretty good lie. You can create a situation to where it makes it look like there is a time period that has been marching on, and these authors existed and they've been citing each other, so it's okay to take all of these citations from multiple books that magically show up in the Middle Ages and then combine them into a work by Manetho. Alright, so this is where the mainstream and alternative is at when it comes to Manetho. Right? They don't look beyond this. They don't acknowledge, well, actually, it's funny. Both sides will acknowledge that there was a huge forgery industry during the Middle Ages. But of course, the stuff that they believe in wasn't forged. The stuff that they are using is 100% accurate. Yes, there's a lot of forgeries, but not this stuff. Manetho is 100% real, right? This is the mindset. This is what they are doing. Now, it gets funnier when it comes to this manuscript as well, because both sides are also willing to acknowledge that there are legitimate corruption and redactions and errors that exist in this manuscript. Like, they'll admit that. They'll admit that there are problems, and I already kind of said this earlier, but they will only say that there are problems if it goes against what their current belief system is. All right? They really don't want to acknowledge that all the different authors that would, quote unquote, cite, the Manetho works would have their own motives, and that they would cite it accurate. Right, so a lot of the authors that, supposedly cite this work, they've got their own religious, political, apologetic, land grabbing, whatever reasoning you can think of, they would have their own reasons to cite certain specific areas. And not only that, it's entirely possible that they could have altered some of the citations. Right, this is very basic human psychology. This is what humans do. So when we look at names, dates, the dynasties, stuff like that, it's entirely possible that these cited sources are omitting things like dates, dynasties, and names, right? Or they have changed them. Here's another problem, all right? And it's a simple problem, and I probably should have talked about it earlier, but think about this. If you are going to have this manuscript being created in 300 BC, and we don't have the original. Remember, we don't have the original. So the only thing we have, at best, is copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. That would be at best. So what this means is that as copies of copies of copies of copies are being made, and apparently they're being made by people who live in the Dark Ages who are illiterate, by the way, right? You're going to have copying errors. So let's just say people do their best and they don't try to change anything. They don't go out of their way to inject their own corruption or their own needs or their own methods. Let's just say they're honest. You are going to have copying errors, right? 2,300 years, or let's just say the Middle Ages. Let's say 2,000 years. 2,000 years is a long time. Do you know what happens in 2,000 years? Languages change. People move around, second law of thermodynamics is alive and well. You are going to have all this crazy stuff going on. Do you honestly believe that the work of Manetho would come down to anybody in the Middle Ages in a pristine condition? I mean, come on. I mean, really? Now, the good news is that a lot of people will acknowledge this problem, but they won't acknowledge how it affects their current outcomes. And that's the problem. Yes, there's problems, but not with my stuff. Okay, so what do you do with that, right? Like, how do you even debate anybody like that? Like, you'll find these people who will use all of this Manetho work, and then in the light of everything we've covered so far, like, how do you take them seriously? I mean, how do you even debate them? Right? There's no debate. The work is not. There's no reason to believe in the work. Okay, and it gets worse. So let's keep going over the problems. Right? So there's also chronological inconsistencies in the book itself. Now, this is really, in my opinion, what shows you how this book was just contrived, during a time period to where it was needed. But a lot of people don't want to look at it like that. But here's the problem, or one of the main problems. We have a situation in the history to where you have what they call exaggerated reigns. So you have kings who are reigning for hundreds of years in this book. Right? And okay, so that's a problem, right? Nobody lives for hundreds of years. And then, of course, you can find the excuses, the excuses will fly, right, from both sides, the alternative and the mainstream, as to what's really going on here. Let me explain to you what's actually happening. So, for example, what the mainstream will do is they will say, well, that's like one family, right? So if you have, I don't know, the reign of King Johnson, right? The Johnsons reigned for, 300 years. It's not one guy that reigned for 300 years. It's multiple Johnsons. It's like, okay, but there's no evidence for that. Like, the main problem with that explanation is there's no reason to believe that. Like, where's the consistency? Why do some reigns have multiple people under the same name, but others don't? Right? It doesn't make sense. There's nothing there. Now, the biblical side of people, they've got a good one, which is not bad, actually. But they will then jump in and they will say, well, people just lived longer back in the day. And there might be something to that. Not in this work, but that is an interesting perspective. But, unfortunately for them, we have no reason to believe that either. Right? There's nothing in the book that says, these dynasties were regular humans who lived regular lives, and then this guy lived 300 years and it was one dude, and whatever. There's nothing like that. So you already have a problem when you're looking at this particular chronology. The chronology itself is not human. Yeah, it's not human in nature. And then I know you can take that and you can go farther with it, but there's no reason to. Don't forget, you don't have to go crazy with this, because this whole Manetho thing is garbage. Okay, okay. Anyway, there's another interesting thing that exists in the work, and that is legitimate phantom time. All right, so there's this thing called linear stacking that happens, and what this linear stacking in chronology has done is that it stretched the Egyptian history by essentially centuries or millennia longer compared to what archaeologists find. And that's a big one. That's actually a huge one, because here's something that people don't want to acknowledge when it comes to Egypt. The reality is, if you believe in the mainstream Egyptological chronology, Egypt was around for thousands of years. Thousands of years is a long time for a civilization to exist. When we look at the evidence in Egypt, we do not find thousands of years of human occupation. It just does not exist. There's nothing there. There's no way around this. All evidence points toward Egypt was only around for a relatively short period of time before it started to degrade. And interestingly enough, when we look at real history and real science, that's exactly what we should find. Right? The archaeological evidence does indeed support the real history, and that's a topic for a different time. But, if you believe in the mainstream chronology, you have a problem. Right? The archaeology does not agree with you. Right? The chronology presented in Manetho, it's just too long. All right. For example, right, to give you guys an example, the 7th dynasty in Manetho, you have essentially what they call 70 kings in 70 days. Right? This is a period of time to where you literally have one king per day. And it's like, what? Like, what are you talking about? It doesn't make sense. Right? And there's all kinds of these inconsistencies in Manetho. So if you're finding this level of inconsistency in a work that is being used as a foundation for calibrating chronology, not only for ancient Egypt, but also for, Greece, Rome, and the surrounding area, we have a problem. It's a legitimate issue. It's a scientific problem. All right. So the next thing we also run into is the supposed Ptolemaic context. All right. So like I said, Manetho was writing under Ptolemy II. Because of who he was supposedly writing under, right, his entire work may have been shaped to flatter the Greek rulers by showing Egypt as ancient and orderly, which would essentially reinforce dynastic continuity. Right? This could have been written, if it was real, simply to prop up the Ptolemies. That's a real possibility. If you're going to believe it, you have to also entertain that fact. Right? That's a real possibility. Right? The other weird thing about it is there's this weird anti-Hyksos spin. And it's weird because he portrays the Hyksos as like these monstrous invaders. But the archaeology suggests that they integrated into Egyptian society, right? And the Hyksos thing gets a little weird because there's some chronological issues there. But anyway, there's this weird tone to it, right? You can see that it's like, what's going on here? Like, why is it so anti-Hyksos? Right now, the negative portrayal of the Hyksos may also reflect the Egyptian priestly hostility that they had during that time, if it's real. Only if it's real. But, that's a possibility. Right? So there's a bias. I mean, do you really want... we can't have bias in science, right? We don't do that. If there's a bias in science, we don't trust the science. That's all there is to it. It's not good science. So why do we accept it here on the text of Manetho? It's a legitimate question. All right, so there's also weird aspects of this thing too. So Menes is a weird. In the book, there's a king called Menes, and he's considered the first king, right? And he's like this foundational figure. The problem with the way that this begins is that the archaeological evidence doesn't support any of this. Right now, when we get into Egyptian archaeology, it doesn't really support anything the mainstream claims. So it gets a little weird, but it is interesting to note that Menes is not supported by the archaeology, at least not in the sense that he is the first king. Which actually brings us to another problem. When we look at these texts, we find that all of these Egyptian names are going to essentially be filtered through Hellenized Greek. Now that makes sense. But the problem with this is that we have no way of looking at, a Greek spelling of an Egyptian ruler and relating that to a real Egyptian ruler that existed in the past. Right? So, for example, if you look at the way they have it right now in the mainstream, the Djoser will appear as some guy named Testhoros in Manetho. Right, so how do you get from Djoser to Testhoros?
Tosorthos.
Whatever. I don't know. I don't speak it. It doesn't matter. But the point stands. Right? You have two completely different names representing one person. How are you accurately going to relate one to the other? Right? You have no way of doing that. That is not happening. And that's all over the place, by the way. It's all throughout the entire manuscript. Right? This is a serious problem. What this means is, at best, every single name can be interpreted technically however you want. You can really play games with that. And of course, they do play games. Like I said earlier, people will acknowledge what I'm saying here, mainstream and alternative. They will acknowledge, yes, there are problems. But they will never acknowledge the problems if it comes to something that they believe in. Right? Whatever they think they've figured out, that's correct. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay? You can't do that. Right? It also gets worse because there's so many problems. All right. So another thing we find is missing pharaohs. Right. There's literally missing pharaohs in this supposed complete chronology. So Manetho will sometimes completely skip rulers that we believe we know existed. So, for example, on monuments, we will find names, and then we do not find the corresponding name in Manetho's history. Now, that's a problem, right? I mean, especially if you are mainstream. If you are in the mainstream, that's huge. I mean, that's a serious problem because you can physically see it. If you actually believe in what mainstream Egyptology is telling you, that's a problem. How many times am I going to say that this is a problem? I'm going to keep saying it until everybody realizes that you cannot use Manetho for any kind of chronology work whatsoever. I'm going to keep going. Right, it gets worse because we also find a situation to where it looks like there are names that were either completely invented and pulled out of the air, or we also find duplicate names as well. All right, so we run into a situation to where some names in the dynasties that he writes about, they can't be matched to anything. They're not matched to any known king. You can't calibrate it to, relative to other histories. There's just nothing there. Right? And it gets weird because you find a situation to where, some of these names either are completely fictitious or they're duplications. And as we all know, duplications in history is a real problem. And in fact, the Manetho king list, it's funny, now that I think about it, the Manetho's history really is a very interesting insight into the corruption on how history has been manufactured. Because it really does have basically every single problem that we find with all these forged manuscripts all bundled into one manuscript. And it's like this exemplification of garbage. It's hilarious. And people use it to cite for their garbage. And it gets worse too. Because when we look at somebody like Africanus or Eusebius, if we look at those two guys who both used Manetho, you will find that these two guys will literally disagree on names, reign lengths, and the order in which these kings supposedly existed. Yeah. It's insane. Right? Josephus will go out of his way to selectively quote things, and so he will apparently cut stuff off. Right? So he'll go through and he'll quote Manetho, but he will often... It's funny, he will often distort a lot of the passages for a very specific reason, right? He's trying to defend the Jews. So anytime he cites Manetho, supposedly, he's going out of his way to twist whatever he's got to accomplish something. Now, centuries later, you will find Cincillus trying to reconcile, supposedly, all of these conflicting sources. But while he's doing this, while Cincillus is trying to reconcile all the problems, we find a situation to where he may have actually introduced even more errors. All right, this is how Manetho's manuscript is built up. This is where it comes from. Are you convinced yet? Do you want me to keep going? Oh, I can keep going. I can go on this all day, and we're going to keep going because I'm not even at the hour mark. I've been doing pretty good at sticking to an hour, and I'm going to keep trying, so we're going to keep going. All right, so it gets even crazier. Because when you look at Manetho's framework for his history, we find a really weird situation chronologically. Because if you read his work literally, like you should, right? You should be able to read his work literally, and it should give you a scientific chronology. We find a situation to where his history of Egypt goes back nearly 36,000 years. 36,000 years. Now, I kind of mentioned, mythological or legendary kings or whatever, but you'll find a lot of these guys the further back you go. And this is where biblical people will really start to kind of latch on to things, because the Bible says people lived longer and, stuff like that, right? So it sounds good. And so they'll latch on to this, right? But this is a problem. It's a scientific problem. Now, by the way, as a side note, that does not mean that at some point in time humans didn't live longer. That's entirely possible. And actually, we can discuss that one day because, as we know now, the Earth's electrical potential is completely different from what it was over the past few thousand years going further back. And of course, once you change electrical potential, you change the way DNA works. And since DNA, anyway, the whole thing gets weird. But I'm not saying, okay, I guess it makes it sound like I'm defending Manetho. I'm not. No, it's not it. The point here with the 36,000 years in Manetho's manuscript is that's how off it is. That's how crazy it gets. Right? Manetho was not trying to write, as far as I'm aware. I don't know if you can make a case for this, but Manetho was not trying to write some kind of a crazy mythological piece to where things were going back 36,000 years and you had all this weird stuff going on, right? I don't think so. I've never seen anybody make that claim. Somebody might, but I haven't seen it. At least not to any credible way. All right, so that's a problem. Now, in the mainstream, archaeologists, they will only say that Egypt is around like 3100 or existed around 3100 BC. Right, so Egyptologists, they're not going to push it out that far back. And I realize that there are alternative people who want to push Egyptian stuff back like 100,000 years. That's ridiculous. There's no reason to do that. We do not have to get crazy. All right, and Manetho is not substantiating any of those claims. There's no reason for that. But even the mainstream doesn't agree with Manetho, right? Because the mainstream will only go back to 3100 BC. So things get weird when a mainstream person is going to use Manetho for any kind of a source, right? There's already a conflict there, and it's an admitted conflict. So it's a problem, all right? So, looking at Manetho, it's insane. I mean, the fact that anybody uses Manetho for anything other than a study into how corrupt the Middle Ages were is just, it's laughable. I can't even talk anymore. I mean, that's how much this is like brain rotting me just thinking about it. Right, I have to watch biblical scholars quote Manetho while they try to figure out who Moses was, and they try to, date all of these pharaohs and blah, 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 and you're just like listening to this, and it's like, really? Like, really? Like, that's where you want to go? Like, how are you going to use Manetho for anything? You can't. You cannot use it for anything. I mean, all the reasons that I just went over, and there's more, by the way. I mean, I'm just I'm just pulling stuff out of my butt, but there's way more reasons. I mean, go do a deep dive into Manetho. It's insane. Right? Between the textual transmission problems, we got all kinds of chronological inconsistencies. See, I can't even speak. Like political and religious biases, legendary and mythical elements that we find because the dang thing goes back 36,000 years. Right? Names that don't match archaeological discoveries. I mean, what do you want me to say? Right? You have contradictions between all of these sources that are supposed to be reliable. I think that's actually one of the good ones. Because if you look at the contradictions with respect to like Africanus or Eusebius or Cincillus or whatever, all these guys, when they're quoting Manetho and they're working with the Manetho script, these are the people who we are trusting to deliver other aspects of history as well. They are. Right? This is a legitimate problem. It's not just a Manetho problem. It really does shed a light on how absolutely shredded and corrupt the Middle Ages were and how unbelievably ridiculous mainstream history is. I mean, we have no reason to believe that any of this is true. Just using the Manetho concept here, we can scientifically claim that the mainstream framework is wrong, it's fictitious, it's corrupt. It is not here to help any of us. Right? The reality is the Manetho framework is being used by people who know how to use it. And it's being pushed onto populations because populations don't care. Right? Most people have no idea who Manetho is. Right? No idea. I guarantee you, I can go to all these, alternative alien pyramid people and ask them about Manetho, and they'll have no clue. They'll have no idea. They'll believe the dates. A lot of them, they will believe the dates. But they will just inject aliens. Manetho doesn't talk about aliens. And I know you can try to say the 36,000 year thing. Yeah. Just shut up. Come on. Really? Is that the route we're going to go? We don't got to do that. Really? We don't need to do that. There's no reason. Right? This is the conundrum. So when you start to see people who are using the Manetho manuscript to prove anything other than how corrupt the Middle Ages were, or how corrupt our mainstream chronology is, you can just move on. There's no reason to pay attention to them. And I hate to say it, because there's a lot of good scholars out there who are using Manetho's framework to support their ideas. But you never hear them talk about all the problems that I just related to you now. Right? If you're going to use Manetho, you have to overcome everything I just said. You do. You have to overcome every single problem that I just pointed out. If you cannot overcome every single problem scientifically, you are scientifically wrong. That's it. That's it. Anybody using Manetho for any kind of a chronological purpose is wrong. Right? And here's the problem. Here it gets even worse. Think about the ramifications. Because people who use Manetho have created timelines, have created chronologies that are now accepted. And if there's even just one misplaced dynasty, off by 1 year, that changes everything, that completely changes the structure of chronology, right? It throws everything off. It makes everything unreliable. Right, you are now misdating other histories if you are using Manetho as a calibration. If you are using modern Egyptology as a calibration for, say, Rome or Greece or whatever, right? Any civilization that you try to use it on. If Manetho is wrong at all, which he is, then that leads to other civilizations being calibrated and dated wrong as well. And there's no way around this. Right? There's nothing we can say. It's wrong. So, when you hear me talking about things like, there's no such thing as an ancient Greek society, never existed. When I talk about things like, there's no such thing as 3 Roman empires, there's no such thing as these dark ages. Right? Suddenly, that's not schizo anymore. Suddenly, everything I just said is backed by science. It's backed by common sense. It's backed by critical thinking. This is the reality. Now, of course, this also means that we do not know as much as we originally thought that we knew. And that's what scares people. Because right now in the modern age, everybody believes, not everybody, but the general consensus is that we are all enlightened. We know everything, right? We have all this technology. We have the internet, so we have everything figured out. But everything I just said proves that we don't. It means that all of these foundational work with respect to history is garbage. It means that everything you have been taught is wrong, or at least mostly wrong, or inaccurate. How many people really want to reset that aspect of their life? The reality is most people don't care about history in the modern age, so nobody, those people don't care. And they're not going to pay attention regardless of whatever the discovery is, unless they can make a TikTok video on it or something, right? That's all they care about. Give me some views, bro. Right? But if you're a historian, if you are an archaeologist, right? If you are a biblical scholar, whatever, and you have built a framework that relies on something like Manetho, and Manetho is completely wrong, that means your framework is garbage. That means your framework is irrelevant. Or at least it's just wrong. And it means you have to revisit everything. You have to rebuild. Humans do not like change. And so what I'm saying is that humans would have to make massive changes to their life. If you're a historian, especially a historian who makes a living off of this stuff, these guys aren't admitting they're wrong. Never. Right? They have a following. right? Or they have a nice little cushy job at their community college. They're not going anywhere. They are not going to shake up the boat, but they don't have the capability to do it anyways. They don't have the mental fortitude. They don't have the psychological strength to step up and say, guess what? We are wrong and we need to make a change. They're not going to do that because that requires that requires strength. And that strength has been conditioned out of most people. Right, so what I'm pointing out here with Manetho is that we have to step up and admit what's wrong. And that's it. I mean, if you are not willing to step up here, right here on the Manetho thing, yeah, I'm challenging you. If you're not willing to step up, then what else are you not willing to step up on that's wrong? Right? This is a simple thing to step up on. Manetho is wrong. That means mainstream Egyptology is wrong. That means mainstream biblical scholars are wrong, but that's okay. Right? This is important to science. In science, we don't just want to prove something is real, we also want to discount the garbage. Right? We want to eliminate. Elimination is just as important as proving something. So once we eliminate Manetho, suddenly all of history opens up. You now have a fresh canvas on which to start analyzing evidence that might actually lead you somewhere. And I need you to do that because I don't have time to keep doing this stuff forever. I can only do like one show right now a week and it's just killing me. Plus, everybody's smarter than me anyway. So, go figure this out. Right now. I know. Okay, I'm done.